A CEO whose company had just successfully completed its initial public offering and was steadily profitable, whose specific business model was working measurably better than most industry observers had predicted only a few years earlier, deliberately began quietly investing hundreds of millions of dollars into a specific technology whose entire purpose was to eventually make his own currently profitable business model completely obsolete. His name was Reed Hastings. Born in 1960 in Boston, Massachusetts, he had served in the United States Marine Corps briefly before joining the Peace Corps, where he taught high school mathematics in Swaziland from 1983 to 1985. After returning to the United States, he earned a master's degree in computer science from Stanford University, founded a software company called Pure Software in 1991, and sold that first company in 1997 for a reported price of approximately $700 million. Later that same year, he co-founded Netflix with Mark Randolph, initially built entirely around the specific business model of renting DVDs to customers by mail, delivered through the United States Postal Service in distinctive red envelopes. The original DVD by mail model, while now sometimes remembered as a specifically transitional business idea, was in its own initial period genuinely successful in ways that many established retail and entertainment observers had not initially predicted. Netflix's specific innovation was the combination of an easily browsable online catalog, a subscription-based pricing model that eliminated per-rental late fees, and an efficient distribution operation that reliably delivered DVDs to customers within a small number of business days. The company completed its initial public offering in 2002, and over the following several years grew its subscriber base and revenue at a steadily accelerating rate. Morgan Housel has written that some of the most instructive strategic decisions in modern business involve founders and CEOs who deliberately chose to compete against and eventually replace their own currently profitable business model, before some external competitor with less institutional attachment to the existing revenue stream did the same thing to them from the outside. What makes Reed Hastings' specific 2007 transition worth studying carefully isn't that streaming eventually became the dominant model for video distribution. That outcome now looks obvious in retrospect. It's that when Hastings specifically began significantly investing in streaming infrastructure in 2007, his existing DVD by mail business was still visibly profitable and growing, and the specific decision to actively cannibalize that revenue stream was not obviously wise to a significant number of thoughtful observers at that exact moment. The specific streaming service Netflix launched in January 2007 was, in its initial form, genuinely limited, a small catalog of titles available for online viewing in relatively low video quality, offered as a specific supplemental feature to existing DVD subscribers rather than as a standalone product. Over the following several years, Hastings and his executive team steadily invested in expanding the streaming catalog, upgrading video quality, securing licensing deals with major content owners, and building the specific technical infrastructure required to reliably deliver streaming video at a national and eventually global scale. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized carefully distinguishing between activities that were genuinely creating durable long-term economic value and activities that merely appeared profitable in the short term while quietly eroding the underlying long-term value of the business. Hastings' specific 2007 through 2011 strategic decisions can be understood, in explicitly Graham-consistent terms, as a deliberate choice to accept measurably lower reported near-term profit, in the specific form of large ongoing streaming infrastructure investments and licensing costs, in exchange for beginning to build a fundamentally more durable long-term business position, while the underlying DVD by mail business was still generating enough cash flow to fund that specific transition. Daniel Kahneman's research into the specific psychological phenomenon of loss aversion, the measurable tendency of decision makers to weigh potential losses significantly more heavily than equivalent potential gains, helps explain why the specific type of deliberate business model transition Hastings attempted is genuinely difficult, and historically rare, at established public companies. Kahneman's work suggests that senior executives at a currently profitable company face measurably strong psychological pressure to protect existing revenue streams even when doing so is not, in fact, in the company's own actual long-term strategic interest. Hastings' specific decision to actively cannibalize a currently profitable business model, before external competition forced him to, required overcoming exactly that pattern of institutional loss aversion. In September 2011, Hastings made a specific implementation decision that turned out to be genuinely disastrous. He announced that the DVD by mail business would be spun off into a separate subsidiary called Quickster, with a distinct website and separate billing from the streaming service, alongside a substantial price increase for customers who wanted to keep both services. Customer reaction was overwhelmingly negative. Netflix lost roughly 800,000 subscribers over the following quarter, and the company's stock price declined by roughly 75% from its previous peak in a matter of months. Hastings publicly reversed the Quickster decision within roughly 3 weeks, and eventually publicly apologized for it in detail. Robert Kiyosaki's core lesson about understanding exactly what actually generates lasting value applies here in a specifically counterintuitive direction. The underlying strategic decision Hastings was attempting to make in 2011, cleanly separating the declining physical DVD business from the growing streaming business, so that each could be operated on the basis of its own distinct economics, was arguably strategically sound in specifically abstract terms. What Hastings underestimated at that specific moment was that what Netflix actually owned, at that specific point in its history, was not just two separate services but a specific integrated subscriber relationship built on a specific combined value proposition. Kiyosaki's framework emphasizes carefully understanding what you actually own, and Hastings' specific 2011 mistake was that he treated Netflix as owning two operationally separable products when what it in fact owned was one integrated subscriber trust relationship that a sudden restructuring could measurably damage. Here's an honest complication worth including, since Netflix's eventual streaming dominance is now sometimes retold as though it were a smoothly executed, obviously wise strategic transition. It was not. The Quickster decision of 2011 was, by Hastings' own subsequent public admission, a genuinely serious strategic execution mistake that came close to permanently damaging the company. Multiple experienced business analysts and investors during 2011 and 2012 publicly questioned whether Hastings should remain CEO at all, and the specific eventual recovery of the company, including the specifically successful 2013 launch of Netflix Originals content, beginning with House of Cards, was in real time significantly less certain than it now appears in retrospect. The eventually favorable outcome should not obscure the fact that the transition itself was, at multiple specific moments, genuinely close to failing badly. George S. Clason's advice about patient, disciplined long-term wealth building applies here in a specifically corporate strategic direction. Hastings' overall willingness to accept measurably lower near-term reported profits for roughly 5 years, in exchange for building a fundamentally more durable long-term business position, is structurally consistent with Clason's core philosophy of patient reinvestment. But Clason's philosophy also emphasizes maintaining specific structural discipline during that patient reinvestment period, and the Quickster episode specifically illustrates what happens when the strategic direction is broadly correct but the specific execution decisions along the way are rushed or poorly communicated. This isn't a simple story about a visionary CEO always correctly cannibalizing his own business at exactly the right moment. Hastings got the broad strategic direction genuinely right and the specific execution of one crucial transition step genuinely wrong, and both of those things are separately true. What makes Reed Hastings' specific story worth carefully remembering is the underlying structural insight it illustrates, that deliberately competing against your own currently profitable business model, before an external competitor does, is often strategically correct in principle, but the specific execution details of how the transition is actually managed at the customer relationship level can either quietly succeed or catastrophically fail in ways that are genuinely difficult to predict in advance. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own financial life or business, are you willing to deliberately accept measurably lower near-term returns in order to protect a fundamentally more durable long-term position? And if so, do you have a specific plan for how you would actually execute that transition without accidentally damaging the specific customer, employer, or personal relationships you depend on along the way? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever watched a company or leader you personally admired attempt a genuinely correct long-term strategic transition, and then watched them nearly ruin it through a specific execution mistake? And did that specific mistake permanently change how you evaluate their overall judgment? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most careful reflections on this channel come from people who've thought hard about the difference between strategic vision and specific execution discipline. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Reed Hastings didn't build Netflix into a dominant global streaming company by being unusually good at protecting his existing profitable business model. He built it by deliberately investing hundreds of millions of dollars into a specific technology whose entire purpose was to eventually make that existing profitable business model obsolete, and by narrowly surviving one specific execution mistake along the way that came genuinely close to undoing the whole strategy. A 52-year-old milkshake machine salesman who had spent the previous 3 decades moving between a series of modestly successful but never transformative sales jobs, paper cups, real estate, and most recently a machine that could mix 8 milkshakes simultaneously, drove to a hamburger stand in San Bernardino, California in 1954 because he was genuinely curious why a single restaurant had just ordered 8 of his multi-mixer machines, enough to run 56 simultaneous milkshakes, when most restaurants of that type ordered 1. His name was Ray Kroc. Born in 1902 in Oak Park, Illinois, he had demonstrated from an early age a specific personal disposition towards sales and commerce, dropping out of high school to work, lying about his age to serve as a Red Cross ambulance driver in World War I, spending the 1920s and 1930s moving through a series of sales positions with varying success. By the early 1950s, he had established himself as the exclusive national sales agent for the multi-mixer, a product in which he had invested his own savings and which was generating a reliable if unremarkable income selling to restaurants, diners, and soda fountains across the United States. The drive to San Bernardino in 1954 was not a strategic business development visit. It was the specific commercial curiosity of a salesman wondering why a single location needed so much machine capacity. What Kroc found when he arrived was something he later described in his autobiography as unlike anything he had previously encountered in roughly 3 decades of working in and around the food service industry: a small, impeccably clean, efficiently operated hamburger restaurant that was serving a high volume of customers with a menu so deliberately simple that almost every operational variable had been reduced to its minimum: a fixed menu of hamburgers, French fries, and milkshakes, prepared by a kitchen organized around assembly line production principles that allowed any employee to be trained to any station in a minimal amount of time, sold at a price point significantly below what comparable items cost at competing establishments. Morgan Housel has written that some of the most consequential business opportunities in modern commercial history were recognized not by the founders who created the original version of the idea but by a specific subsequent person who saw, more clearly than the founders themselves, what the specific underlying operational model was genuinely capable of producing at a scale the founders had not attempted and possibly not imagined. Richard and Maurice McDonald had built, in San Bernardino, a genuinely excellent local hamburger business. What Kroc saw in their kitchen was not a local hamburger business. It was a replicable system, a specific set of standardized procedures, portions, preparation sequences, and quality controls that could in principle be reproduced at any location, by any sufficiently trained workforce, to produce a consistent and reliably acceptable product, at a price low enough to attract high volume, with margins tight enough to require that volume but wide enough to sustain a profitable operation at scale. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized the importance of identifying specific businesses whose competitive advantage derived from structural characteristics that would be genuinely difficult for competitors to replicate quickly, rather than from temporary conditions that a well-funded competitor could simply match by spending money. The specific competitive advantage Kroc recognized in the McDonald's system, the specific combination of menu simplicity, preparation standardization, and operational discipline that allowed a McDonald's location to consistently deliver a product of predictable quality at a price that individually more sophisticated competitors could not match, was exactly the kind of structural, process-embedded advantage that Graham identified as producing genuinely durable business value. Daniel Kahneman's research into how expertise in one specific domain can both sharpen and limit a professional's ability to recognize opportunity in adjacent domains applies directly to the specific moment of Kroc's 1954 visit to San Bernardino. Kroc was not a restaurateur. He had spent decades selling equipment to restaurants, which gave him a specific observational knowledge of how food service operations varied in their efficiency, their consistency, and their economic outcomes, without the specific professional investment in any particular operational approach that would have made him resistant to recognizing a genuinely different one. His specific outsider position relative to the restaurant industry was, at that specific moment, a specific advantage rather than a disadvantage. The specific legal and financial structure through which Kroc eventually built McDonald's into a global company is itself one of the most instructive business structure stories of the 20th century. Kroc initially signed a franchise agreement with the McDonald brothers in 1954 that left him with an extremely thin margin, roughly 1.5% of franchisee gross sales, of which he had to pass most to the brothers. The business model was initially so tight that Kroc was personally losing money for years while the franchise count grew. The structural transformation that eventually made McDonald's financially viable at scale came through a specific insight by Kroc's financial advisor Harry Sonneborn, who proposed that the actual business McDonald's should be in was not selling hamburgers but owning real estate, specifically, purchasing or leasing the land under franchise locations and subleasing it to franchisees at a markup, creating a real estate income stream that was structurally independent of the thin food service margins and that grew automatically as each new location was opened. Robert Kiyosaki has cited McDonald's specifically as one of the clearest illustrations of his core distinction between the business you appear to be in and the business you are actually in, noting that McDonald's is not, in any primary financial sense, a hamburger company. It is a real estate company that happens to operate hamburger restaurants on the properties it owns and controls. The specific financial architecture of McDonald's, in which the company's most significant and most durable source of income is the real estate rental income it collects from franchisees who operate on land McDonald's itself owns, is exactly the kind of genuine asset-based cash generation that Kiyosaki distinguishes from the more fragile revenue streams of purely operational businesses. Here's an honest complication worth including. Ray Kroc's specific path to acquiring full control of McDonald's from the McDonald brothers, whom he eventually bought out in 1961 for approximately $2.7 million, has been characterized by multiple historians and by the McDonald brothers themselves in contemporary accounts as significantly more adversarial than the sanitized version Kroc later promoted in his autobiography. Richard McDonald has been quoted as stating that Kroc violated specific provisions of the original franchise agreement and that the eventual buyout was conducted under conditions of pressure that he found genuinely unfair. The specific ethical texture of how Kroc treated the people who created the original business he scaled is not a minor biographical footnote, it is part of the complete historical record of how McDonald's was actually built. George S. Clason's advice about the patient, disciplined accumulation of real assets that produce their own ongoing income is nowhere more literally illustrated in 20th century American business than in the specific McDonald's real estate model that Sonneborn designed and Kroc implemented. Every location McDonald's opened added a specific piece of income-producing real estate to the company's portfolio, simultaneously growing the operational network and the underlying asset base in a specific compounding dynamic that Clason would have recognized as embodying almost exactly the wealth-building philosophy he articulated in the Babylonian parables. This isn't a simple story about a salesman recognizing a great opportunity and seizing it. It's a story about a 52-year-old professional who had not yet achieved anything particularly remarkable, driving to a California hamburger stand out of commercial curiosity, and recognizing in what he found there a specific operational system whose potential scale the people who built it had not fully pursued, and then spending the following 2 decades building that scale, through a specific combination of genuine operational discipline, financial ingenuity, and personal ruthlessness, into the largest restaurant company in the history of the world. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own professional experience, have you ever encountered a specific operational system or business model that seemed to you clearly capable of being applied at a much larger scale than the people currently running it were attempting? And if so, what specifically stopped you from pursuing that observation further? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever recognized, as an outsider to a specific industry or field, an opportunity that insiders seem to be systematically overlooking? And was your specific outsider perspective an advantage in seeing it, or a disadvantage in persuading others that what you were seeing was real? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most practically useful insights on this channel come from people who've experienced exactly that specific tension between outsider perception and insider resistance. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Ray Kroc didn't build the world's largest restaurant company by inventing a better hamburger, or by being younger or better funded than the men who built the original version of what he scaled. He built it by driving to San Bernardino at 52 years old out of simple commercial curiosity, recognizing in what he found there something the people who built it had not fully seen, and then spending the rest of his working life building that something into the specific scale he had seen it was capable of reaching. A woman born into poverty in the American South in 1867, who was the daughter of formerly enslaved parents, who was orphaned by age 7, married by age 14, and widowed with a young daughter by age 20, who spent the following 2 decades working as a laundress in St. Louis for wages that never exceeded $1.50 per day, became by her early 50s the first self-made female millionaire in United States history, building her specific fortune not from inherited capital, not from professional credentials, and not from access to any financial institution willing to lend to a black woman in the American South or Midwest in the early 20th century, but from a hair care product she developed for her own use, manufactured in her own home, and sold door to door in her own neighborhood before she had any employee other than herself. Her name was Sarah Breedlove, known professionally and historically as Madam C.J. Walker. Born on December 23, 1867, on a Louisiana cotton plantation where her parents had been enslaved until the end of the Civil War 2 years earlier, she spent her early childhood in conditions of acute material deprivation that most people who study her life have described as among the most genuinely difficult starting circumstances of any major figure in American business history. The specific combination of poverty, racial segregation, early orphanhood, early marriage, early widowhood, and the specific structural exclusion of black women from essentially every formal economic pathway that might otherwise have offered upward mobility was not a single obstacle. It was a compound, mutually reinforcing set of conditions that would have been genuinely and rationally difficult to imagine overcoming. Morgan Housel has written that genuinely transformative personal financial outcomes sometimes originate specifically in problems so personal and so immediate that no established commercial solution exists for them yet, and that the people most likely to recognize and build those solutions are specifically the people experiencing the problem most directly, not the professional market researchers or the venture investors who evaluate commercial opportunities from a safe distance. Walker's specific hair care problem, the chronic scalp condition, possibly related to poor sanitation, stress, or nutritional deficiency, that was causing significant hair loss, was not her unique problem. It was a specific, widespread, and almost entirely unaddressed problem affecting a large and commercially significant population of Black American women who had essentially no access to hair care products specifically formulated for their hair texture and scalp conditions. Walker has described the initial inspiration for her formula as coming to her in a dream, in which a large black man appeared and told her the specific ingredients to use. A story that subsequent historians have evaluated with varying degrees of literal credulity, but that all have agreed reflects her specific personal experience of arriving at a formulation through a process that was less systematic laboratory research than personal experimentation driven by direct personal need. Whatever the specific origin of the initial formulation, the commercial vehicle through which she built a business from it was not mystical. It was specifically the recognition, beginning in 1905 when she relocated to Denver, Colorado, that the product worked well enough that other women wanted it, and the specific decision to sell it directly, door to door, to those women, rather than waiting for any established retail or distribution channel to take an interest in a product made by a black woman in a domestic kitchen. Benjamin Graham's investment philosophy emphasized that genuine commercial value begins with a specific product or service that measurably solves a real, demonstrable problem for a specific group of customers who have no currently adequate alternative solution. Walker's specific Wonderful Hair Grower, and the expanded line of scalp treatment and hair care products she subsequently developed, addressed a real, measurably large, and genuinely underserved market with a product that demonstrably worked for the specific customers who tried it. The conventional retail and commercial infrastructure of the early 20th century United States was not going to recognize or distribute that product on her behalf. The specific solution she implemented instead, direct sales through a personally trained network of black female agents, was not a second-best alternative to conventional retail. It was a specifically superior distribution mechanism for reaching her specific customer base, which conventional retail was neither equipped nor motivated to serve. Daniel Kahneman's research into how people systematically underestimate the magnitude of structural disadvantages faced by members of marginalized groups, tending to attribute individual outcomes primarily to individual effort and ability while discounting the specific structural conditions that shape the range of possible outcomes, is directly relevant to understanding what Walker's specific commercial achievement actually required. Building a manufacturing and distribution business from essentially no capital, in an era and a region where no bank would extend credit to a black woman, with no formal business education, while simultaneously managing the specific daily realities of being a black woman in the racially segregated early 20th century United States, required not just business acumen but a specific sustained ability to operate effectively in conditions of structural disadvantage that most accounts of entrepreneurial success simply do not incorporate into their analytical framework. Walker relocated to Indianapolis in 1910 and established a factory and training school that became the operational headquarters of her growing manufacturing and sales organization. By that point she had built a national network of sales agents, women she trained personally in her specific products and sales methods, providing them with both the product knowledge and the business skills to operate as independent sales representatives across communities that had no other access to her products. At its peak, her organization reportedly employed or contracted with somewhere between 20 and 40,000 agents across the United States and internationally. Robert Kiyosaki's core distinction between working for money and building systems that produce income independent of your personal daily labor applies directly to the specific organizational structure Walker built through her agent network. The specific sales model she designed did not require her personal physical presence at every transaction. Each trained agent was a largely independent commercial operator who purchased products from Walker's manufacturing operation and resold them directly to customers in her own specific geographic territory. Walker's income from that network grew as the network grew, creating a specific compounding dynamic in which each additional trained agent added a specific increment of distribution capacity that generated its own ongoing revenue stream independent of any additional personal effort on Walker's part. Here's an honest complication worth including. The specific dollar figure most commonly cited for Walker's fortune at the time of her death in 1919, approximately $600,000, equivalent to roughly $10 million in contemporary purchasing power terms, has been assessed by multiple historians with varying degrees of precision, and the specific claim that she was the first self-made female millionaire in American history, while widely repeated and broadly accepted, is based on estimates of her net worth at various points during her life rather than a precisely documented accounting. The commercial achievement is real and genuinely extraordinary by any reasonable standard. The specific numerical claims attached to it should be understood as informed estimates rather than audited figures. George S. Clason's fundamental advice about consistently setting aside a portion of every dollar earned and reinvesting it into productive activities rather than consuming it applies here in a specifically instructive direction. Walker's specific financial discipline during the years when her business was growing, her willingness to reinvest profits into expanded manufacturing capacity, agent training, and eventually the construction of a factory and school, rather than immediately improving her personal consumption level in proportion to her rising income, was the specific capital allocation behavior that converted a successful door-to-door sales operation into a genuinely scaled manufacturing and distribution enterprise. This isn't a simple story about personal determination overcoming all obstacles, a framing that tends to understate the severity of the specific structural conditions Walker navigated and to imply that similar determination in similar conditions reliably produces similar results. What Walker's specific story illustrates is something both more instructive and more honest, that genuinely significant commercial achievement is sometimes most accessible to people who experience a specific problem most acutely, who have no existing solution available to them, and who consequently have both the personal motivation to develop a solution and the direct market knowledge to make that solution genuinely useful to the specific customers it is intended to serve. So here's a question worth sitting with. In your own professional or personal life, is there a specific recurring problem you experience that has no currently adequate commercial solution? And have you considered seriously whether the specific personal knowledge you have of that problem, precisely because you experience it directly, might be the most valuable input to building a genuinely useful solution for the larger group of people experiencing the same problem? Before you leave, I want to hear from you. Have you ever built something, a product, a service, a tool, a process, specifically because you personally needed it and nothing adequate existed yet, and found that other people needed it just as much as you did? Read a few comments before you go. Some of the most practically grounded insights on this channel come from people who've answered that question with specific personal examples. Next week, I'll pick one comment and send its author one of the books that inspired this channel. And if these stories help you think differently about money, you'll find a way to support future research in the description. Every contribution helps buy books, access research, and keep this content free for everyone. Remember this. Madam C.J. Walker did not become America's first self-made female millionaire by gaining access to capital, professional credentials, or established commercial distribution networks, because none of those things were available to a black woman in the early 20th century United States. She built it by making a product she personally needed, selling it to neighbors who needed it too, training tens of thousands of other women to do the same thing, and reinvesting enough of what she earned into expanding that system that it eventually outgrew anything that the structural disadvantages she faced had any power to contain.